Hey, good afternoon, everyone. How was lunch? Hope everyone got something to eat. Um, so since we're all here again, I'm gonna ask us all to stand up again if you want, and just get us back on our toes. If you want, as we already did in the morning, we can do a power pose. You know, as Amy Cuddy would tell us, there are different ways to do it. You can put your hands on your hips, you can put your hands in the air, you can be silent, we can talk, but mostly it's about taking a moment to feel your body and loosening us all up and doing it together so that instead of just the speakers doing it, it's everybody in the room can be in a more similar state of mind and body. And just imagine how much less embarrassing it is because we're all doing it together. I guess so. We did lose, we lost our speaker, but I might need to do some filler. Should have waited. And also now I'll give everyone an opportunity. If you need coffee, there's coffee down here. Take a cup. Apparently, coffee is. I've been led to understand that coffee is very important, at least in the north of Norway, maybe also in the south of Norway. Um, okay, so I'm gonna start, and then, um, well, I it's a real privilege for me to introduce the afternoon session, and introduce our second keynote speaker, Kristine Thalme, who is the director of Ashkal Alwan in Beirut and an activist and somebody who has been very involved in the scene in Beirut to think about culture and its long-term effects and the idea of a living institution. I think that I've had the privilege to work with her before when she was the artistic director of Sharjah Biennale 13 Tamawush. And it was an amazing experience to think about an exhibition unfolding over time and to rethink the temporalities of how we typically consider an exhibition experience. And so I think that we are going to be able to think about continue the conversation about different modalities of institutionality and how that works in a place like Beirut, but how that applies as well to the other contexts that are here. So, without further ado, I'll ask Kristine to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Prem. Thank you. Thank you for everybody being here. It's great. I arrived here on Thursday and I was greeted by a tropical storm. So I'm gonna stay 2 days in the conference, and on Monday I leave back to Beirut. Um, Maybe I'll take this opportunity on a good note to come back because there are many events going on. And of course, I would like to think of a scene that I've been exposed by for a very long time. And we have a lot of artists who are working in Beirut and doing important projects with many institutions here. So, thank you. Good morning, and thank you for all coming. And I'm grateful to Rhea, Chris, and Prem, Rodrigo for all the hard work, and everyone at the UKS Young Artists Society for conceiving and organizing this conference, and for extending their invitation at the moment that I think we would all agree to call critical. In turbulent times marked by political and financial drought, we often get caught up in securing resources and funding, often missing the larger picture. It is most refreshing to be in a gathering of fellow artistic cultural practitioners that aims to reflect upon our structures and modes of operation. I often say that we cannot talk about Lebanon in isolation. You have to understand not only its position within a larger, generally unstable region, but also see developments in its recent history in light of the global transitions of post-modernity. Lebanon's protracted civil wars, to use a term coined by artist and writer Walid Sadiq, who lives and works in Beirut, supposedly subsided around the same time of the so-called revolutions that swept the Eastern Bloc and eventually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. To further complicate it for you, we shall resist using Beirut as a metimony for Lebanon. Beirut is an anomaly insofar that the structures it encompasses and meanings it produces are radically different from the rest of the country. Obviously, the volatility of the whole region is reflected there. Beirut has always been a magnet for those interested in experimentation precisely because of that volatility and openness. It is a seductive structure that makes the city rather fragile, constantly questioning itself. The Ta'if Accord of 1989 brought a nominal end to the Lebanese civil wars. The agreement roughly mapped Beirut's moment of openness to itself and to the world onto a global shifting of ideologies, alliances, and resources. It is generally held that Beirut of the early 1990s boasted virtually no public infrastructure for the arts, no contemporary art museums, and no official institutions that might have been prepared to foster and advance artistic practices. The removal, the exposure to novel ideas brought by returning expatriates, with several artists among them, and the Hariri government investment in media and audiovisual infrastructure all contributed to producing a new, unprecedented strata of art practitioners who viewed themselves as resuming a discontinued legacy of the artists that preceded them after the Civil War's interruption. Akram Zaatari, artist and co founder of the Arab Image Foundation, once said that at that moment, work was being produced out of a sense of urgency and not as a response to an art market. It is within shifting paradigms and critical frameworks that three key proto institutions were founded in the early 1990s, between 1992 and 1998. Masrah Beirut, a very prominent theater, or Beirut Theater, provided virtually the only interdisciplinary platform for a young generation of artists experimenting with media and creating engaged and politicized work. Between 1997 and 2001, Pascal Vrali and Yes Khouri, a prominent writer in Beirut, in the Nahar newspaper, held the seminal Eylul Festival. And in 1993, a group of artists and art enthusiasts, including Marwan Ishmawi, Rania Tabbara, Mustafa Yammout, Akaziko, an activist, and myself, registered the Lebanese Association for Plastic Arts, Ashkal Alwan. Out of the three initiatives, only Ashkal Alwan remains active today. What could be extrapolated from identifying this moment in Beirut of the early 1990s is the emergence of a phenomenon within a larger regional as well as global geopolitical moment. The city was still questioning and redefining itself. What is Beirut? This was a question that my friends and colleagues were asking in the 90s after the alleged conclusion of the civil wars. The trajectory of Ashkal Alwan's institutional development could be summarized in three phases. The first phase from 1995 through 2000 was marked by a commitment to accessing and reclaiming public spaces in Beirut, as well as to present the work of contemporary Lebanese artists. Phase two was characterized by the development of discursive practices around contemporaneity that transcend locality, which stretches from 2000 through 2010, with the first edition of Homeworks Forum in 2002 as the highlight of that phase. Phase three, what can be described as an educational turn, in which the focus shifted towards pedagogical shortcomings in graduate arts and humanities education offerings across the region, and which was characterized by the launch of the Homework Space program from 2011 and ongoing. From 1995 to 2000, we worked in Beirut streets, its tree front, its gardens, including one traumatized by a public hanging that took place after the civil wars. That was the first post-war art project. It came at a time when East and West Beirut were still partially close to one another. What was important to me was the question of, do we have a public space in Beirut? And when I say Beirut, I don't mean Lebanon, I mean the city. Later, I become also interested in Ramallah, Cairo, Tehran, as opposed to Palestine, Egypt, or Iran. I'm interested in the cities themselves. This initial phase of working within the urban parameter of the city was marked by an unmistakably local outlook when it came to the artists as well as to the thematics being explored. Those were predominantly events where Lebanese artists presented Lebanese art to the Beirut public, Lebanese art, and that referenced the lived experiences of people in Beirut. Four public interventions were organized, from the Sanaya Garden Project in 1995 to the Hamra Street Project in 2000, that allowed artists such as Marwan Rishmawi, Tony Shakar, Lamia Jurej, and many others to obstinately impose a vision of artistic cultural practices as vessels through which civic discourse could and should exist and express itself in the public realm. The temporal informality we came to embody and experience was one of a continuous present, allowing us to gear our concerns and interventions toward the here and now, along a rich community of artists, architects, writers, lawyers, educators, and activists. At the time, most of the Lebanese public did not acknowledge contemporary art and what these artists were doing, accusing their output of being empty gestures and labeling it as Western art. There was almost no recognition of the work that we were all doing. In 2002, Ashkal Alwan shot to prominence after the founding of Homeworks, our biannual forum on cultural practices, a turn of events that has since led to outgrowing Beirut's public spaces and to a sharpening of a gaze beyond Lebanon's borders. This change came in line with increased interest on behalf of Western governments in promoting cross cultural dialogue and understanding between the so called Middle East and the West in the wake of 9/11. Ashkal Alwan has since held seven editions of Homeworks Forum, catapulting the platform into becoming one of the most significant and sought contemporary art gatherings in the region. In 2011, Ashkal Alwan launched the Homework Space Program, HWTP, a 10-month study program that enrolls 12 to 17 artists per year. The program is open to artists and other practitioners from Lebanon and the world over to develop their formal technical and theoretical skills in a critical setting, and provides enrolled fellows with tutorials and resources to facilitate and support their art practice. HWP was initially developed to explore free, transdisciplinary, critical models of art education in Lebanon and the region, where education is mostly privatized. Currently in the eighth year, the program aims to include a wide range of practitioners and guest professors, all the while addressing geopolitical particularities and existing conditions in art and the educational landscape. HWP works like a traditional course in that it has a solid structure with seminars and group critiques and a certain group dynamic that evolves among peers over a year. However, its fluidity lies in the refusal to reproduce calcified notions of a recurring faculty. Rather, there are different visiting artists and professors whose collective visions inform each year. The program is as much about what it teaches as it is about what our fellows experience in the city and what they bring to it. We believe it is important that they connect and collaborate with organizations such as Beirut Art Center, a space and platform dedicated to contemporary art, Arab Image Foundation, a non for profit that aims to track down, collect, preserve, and study photographs from the Middle East, North Africa, and the Arab diaspora. MARSA, a health center providing specialized medical services for at risk youth and marginalized communities in Lebanon. And Public Works, a multidisciplinary research and design studio that engages critically and creatively with a number of urban and public issues in Lebanon. The trajectory I outlined from sporadic, one off interventions in public spaces to creating a permanent space for production and education is best reflected in the opening of Ashkal Alwan's current venue. In 2011, we moved to a 2,000 square meter multipurpose facility dedicated to contemporary artistic practices, research, production, and education. We are now able to provide an array of facilities and educational platforms, including production and editing studios, performance spaces, auditoria, and Lebanon's first multimedia public library for contemporary arts. A physical space meant that people were able to get together and form practices of community, kinship, and self care. And a city where certain communities are systematically marginalized, any space for connection and solidarity is important. It becomes a space where people can take refuge and where being critical of existing hegemonies is possible. As an institution that emerged out of necessity, supported by a fluid network of artists, architects, writers, filmmakers, curators, and cultural practitioners, the institutional practices entrenched in the internal works of Ashkal Alwan are guided by openness, collectivity, and responsiveness to shifting conditions. To give you insight into the process of developing Homeworks Forum, which is a lot like everything else we do not think about it in a formalic way. Some molecules come together and they make a great atomic collision. Some others come together and produce a structure that is polite and prim, and others do not work whatsoever and are redundant. We are not trying to produce beautiful shows or perfect conferences and symposia. The strength of Homeworks is that it's not a biennale, it's not a conference either. It is what comes out of an intense process of thinking and accumulation. It is like a chronicle of its time. The chemistry inspired analogy here, the process of feedback loops, could be expanded to encompass most internal practices within Ashkal Alwan, from decision making mechanisms and curatorial approaches to the composition of the many configurations of individuals who worked inside and around Ashkal Alwan over the years. The fluidity of strategy and fluency in position periodically lead to a fresh reinvention of our institutional DNA. It is exactly that viewing our milieu as an autonomous yet porous ecological system occupied by many bodies, indigenous and foreign, friendly and invasive, symbiotic and parasitic, that is instilled in every new group of people that has run Ashkal Alwan over the past 25 years. It is a common social code that informs and governs our interactions within this community we have co created. In practical terms, this common code replaces the typical job description. We haven't used those in a long time. And even if a highly specialized position is created, say an archivist or a communications officer, they systematically step outside the parameters of their positions to fulfill roles that were not pre-configured for them. I have always thought of this as a form of buying in, a collective vision, an institution of individuals all singing from the same sheet of music. In turn, it means that everyone must have a meaningful voice in the development of a mission, the vision, the values, and strategic directions, which is the true organizational openness we aspire for. Without buy in, there will be a cacophony in execution and implementation. All of Ashkal Alwan's activities, programs, and services are free of charge. Homeworks, forums, performances have traditionally been ticket free. An HWP study program is tuition free, with each fellow scholarship estimated at $20,000. As such, Ashkal Alwan has always financed its activities through a combination of funding from foundation grants and individual donors. For the past 5 years, we have been witnessing and responding to ever shifting funding trends in which financial support from traditional international funding bodies has been either fading gradually or conditioned to the implementation of specific political agendas through public programming. In response, we are pushed to developing long term strategies to concentrate fundraising efforts towards less reliance on foundation giving and cultivating more support from individual donors, especially from board members. To contextualize, in 2016, 26 of Ashkal Alwan's budget was covered by foundation giving. This ratio went down to about 10% of the total budget in 2017 and 2018. Likewise, income generation from space rental, cafeteria revenue, and book sales has been increasing gradually, standing at $25,000 to $30,000 a year. You could check all of these numbers and the budget on our website. The reason I'm citing these figures is to practically demonstrate the structural changes in our economies we all have to face. I've always held that institutions are like living things, not very different from the people who institute them and whom they serve. They live and they die. No institution is invincible nor irreplaceable. Next, not for profit organizations typically aspire to being adaptive, unable to die. What you'd have is a cancerous cell. Healthy organizations like healthy cells grow, replicate, communicate with one another, and eventually die. Rigid, unhealthy organizations, on the other hand, demonstrate cancerous behavior. They grow in an unbridled manner, they proliferate, lose ability to communicate with other cells, and they cannot die. Status quo organizations suffer from top down control over decision making and eventually lose their ability to adapt or respond to circumstantial and political turmoil shifts. I would like to take on now a rather controversial position that we all at Ashkal Alwan talk about. This is a subject that is very important for us nowadays. At this point, at the hope that this might stir the necessary debate to be had at a gathering like this and at a moment like the one we are living in. Unlike the historic moment of the end of the 1980s, what we are dealing with today as institutions is not the old struggle between subversion and incorporation. Instead, what we are witnessing is the pre incorporation of all aspirations, desires, structures, etc., into a totalizing neoliberal mindset. Take, for instance, our use of terms like independent and alternative, which we deploy to designate the rebellious and subversive nature of our institutions, as if we are the first to employ such radical gestures. The truth of the matter is that alternativeness and radicality have become empty signifiers, deployed performatively and often in spite of institutions, replicating and reproducing problematic structures. In other terms, they are nothing more than subgenre within the larger mainstream of cultural practices, at times even becoming a hegemonic style, which is more the case when traditional institutions such as the state, the museum, or the academy are absent from the picture, such as in Lebanon, for instance. It is clear that the models we have envisioned and developed for the 1990s and early 2000s are no longer valid, let alone effective or truly disruptive. It is no secret that our institutions have gradually grown to become conditioned by and dependent on the very structures we once opposed. Instead of occupying gardens and claiming our right to public spaces, we have filled private properties with our art and complicitly engaged in the gentrification of our neighborhoods and cities. Exactly what happened with us when we moved to the new area. We gentrified the whole area. We have taken artwork out of the gallery space and straight into the collector's vaults. Instead of pulling common resources and engaging in an emancipatory economy of bartering services, we have grown ever more reliant on corporate capital and should investment that we scramble to discuss funding trends and shifting public policies at the first sight of losing our precious funding. When did when did we go so implicated in the very systems we were meant to subvert? The strategies that we worked before don't apply anymore because the overall climate is both market driven and defined by growing austerity measures and neo fascist policies. We need new strategies for working in and around these increasingly restrictive environments. It is also important to realize that institutions live and die like everything else. Once again, no institution is invincible or replaceable. They may work well for 10, 15, 20 years, but at some point the assignment they have set for themselves no longer holds. I think perhaps it's better to move on once that occurs because the risk is that the organization will just start running on autopilot, creating conventional apparatuses, memberships, endowments, co ops, and so on, you name it, simply to adhere to a generic notion of what an institution should be and losing its sense of the purpose it was created for. It is within this mindset that Ashkal al once tries to coil itself into a beating, vibrating drum, morphing this cacophony into new shapes and forms that can at times be silent or muffled or invisible or completely muffled by other authorities at hand. Of course, what I'm outlining here is not new and have indeed been proposed by different currents of artists, curators, and scholars who have worked around, through, and beyond institutional critique and its many current ramifications. However, such clarifications are an option. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristine, for that fantastic and provocative talk. Can I keep you here at the podium for a moment, or would you?
No, no.
So I'm going to. I think question slips are going around as well, and so please give them back to somebody, and we'll pull from them too. I just wanted to pose one question. There are many questions I could ask, but the one that came to mind is I really appreciated in questioning the terminology of the independent or the alternative institution. You also mentioned that when those terms are used, sometimes they're used without acknowledging their predecessors or the previous instances of that. And so I just wanted to ask, actually, in thinking about Ashkal Alwan's original model, or in its moment of founding, but also over its years of development, can you cite any of the institutional models that might have served as either precedents or counterexamples to what you were doing, but that informed how you structured it?
I mean, definitely Beirut was predominantly taken by traditional galleries and market driven galleries. And the idea of not for profit was not something that people endorsed in the city. However, there were a couple of models that were an inspiration for me, which I mentioned in my talk, is مسرح المدينة de Beirut, which was done by Lies Khouri and Pascal Vghali, and that later on Aylul Festival, which was a very, very important festival in the history of Lebanon. But also to give a history about Lebanon, there were two major theaters, Théâtre de Beirut and also Masrah al Medina, which is run by another, figure in the city. And when Hariri came, the famous, renowned Hariri that was assassinated in Lebanon, Masrah Beirut was predominantly geared by communists. So the the left wing of Beirut, that I don't know if it exists now or it exists anywhere in the world, but Hariri, as a head of cabinet, supported the other theater to counter attack the theater and to actually muffle the idea that education, arts, and performativity comes from the left. So this is the podium, this is the platform that, as a kid, as somebody who was, trained in this, some of these institutions, have been exposed to many of the programs, this very restricted arena, but was a very tough arena, about very presence of political fight and a political urgency of who rules the city. So institutions were vehicled towards this representation of a political fight. So you had to buy in when you are part of this. You had to buy in and take a kind of a position. So these are some of the institutions that are not a lot in Beirut, and that I could really, these are the most important that I think have informed me. So
Thank you. Okay, so why don't we take questions from the audience? We can start with questions from the audience, and then we'll pull from the hat from anything that people have written.
Thanks so much for the talk. Just to pick up, I felt like there was a little frisson in the audience when you talked about this this kind of precuperation, this recuperation in advance of certain strategies or languages about radicality. I just wonder if you could say anything more specific about that, and also in relation to the metaphor you were using at the end about the drum and this idea of these different kinds of reverberation. How, again, if it's possible to be specific about what does that mean in practice, and how does that allow you to slip out of that net?
I mean, we've been thinking lately a lot about um, political urgencies that are taking place in the region and specifically in Beirut. And you think of so many things that, like censorship, like being able to expose programs where when you're being political, they you know, either shut it down or people are detained, taken to jail, and all of that. I think being like almost witnessed almost 4 generations of working with artists and working in the city, in public space, then tea fronts, then institutions. How we started in the 90s was actually and simply meeting in cafes. And we were a group of people and friends that we met in cafes and produced all the critical thought that actually informed us at a later stage. And at that point, beginning of 90s, the market was very shy. When I think of now and almost, I don't want to be dramatic and say impossibility, but we are hitting a place where many institutions, I know many initiatives in Beirut, like Bidayat, which is for Syrian artists, for example. They produce um, video and moving image for Syrians and Palestinians, and of course Lebanese as well. They're gonna maybe stop their operation because funding bodies are interested now in peacemaking grants. So if you are working inside Syria and you want to get these people inside Syria again who are completely conflicted between the Turkish president Erdogan, who shut the borders and put a wall so they cannot even enter, and Lebanon, who shut all the borders on them. So these people are left to die inside under the pretext of peacemaking existence. And if you think of other institutions in Beirut who are in a very difficult situation, and Ashkal Al One is one of them, the Arab Image Foundation is one of them, Beirut Art Center is one of them, all of these people are one of them. I think maybe it will be 2 years wishful thinking that we need to really change what we are doing because, as I said, it doesn't really work and physically we cannot continue. So my sense of urgency will not stop. We have a 2,000 square meter that was given to us by a Lebanese, benefactor that is for free. We're thinking now of how to change this and go into again an apartment like the 90s. But also, if this is also not possible, I think we go back the way we worked before. We do small lunches, we do small meetings in cafes. And I'm really, really inclined now to concentrating on more small projects that are really, this is what makes me think and not feel completely dependent on anybody. The way we started in the 90s, we would do a project with $1,000, you see? And this is how it gives me the agility. If you don't have this agility and you don't have the characteristics of a chameleon like person or animal, you can't really continue. And that's very important, not only about funding, it's about the urgency of a kind of a bouncing board, a drum that reflects the cacophony around you. If you're not in your work, if homework doesn't reflect what's happening politically in Beirut, what does it mean? And if we don't get our students to Beirut, somebody from Ramallah in Palestine, somebody in Athens, somebody from Oslo, somebody from Jakarta, somebody from Tokyo, and somebody from Cairo, what does it mean to have all of what we're doing at the moment? And it's with all um, simplicity that we actually could take a couple of years as hiatus to rethink what we're doing. Because even if we, all the institutions that are here, nobody's work would disappear. It will always be latent. It will be there. It will be there. It will be, underground. It will be in our muscles. It will be in our minds. It will be everywhere. Nothing. Many people will pick it up. They will take on from there and they will continue. So institutions are very elastic. Take the life of Ashkal Alwan. Every 5 years or so, it changes with the team that comes over. So this institution has been changing at least for 5 or 6 times because I'm not the only one working there. And that is an amazing team. One of them is Muhammad Abdullah sitting here. I have people who are working day and night to take this on. And it reflects the emotions of these people and the historicity and the urgency of what we're living in the city. When people are protesting in the streets and you get somebody to do a talk and then they come and take you to jail, then you need to really evaluate what you're doing because you are not part of ArtNet. You are trying to think in juxtaposition, of course, not to say that we are innocent. We actually gentrified art. We are responsible for that. But also to understand this gentrification that evoked, you need to think of this position I am talking about.
I'll ask a question from a card. The question is just how do you treat institutional cancer?
By not giving it an antibody, by just letting it, decay and go. And this is the any way, if we want to think of everything, everybody has cancer cells already. Okay, you do not want to use laser to eradicate them. You want to live with them. And as I said, Ashkal Al-1 has many lives, had and has many lives, 5 or 6. So this is a death. And then people are coming out. These are the people who are running Ashkal Al-1. It is different from the Ashkal Al-1 that I worked with Amal Isa in Beirut 7 years ago. The team is different now, so they get their urgencies, they get their sensitivities, they get their political aspirations. That's the agility I'm talking about, and that's, the cancerous cells we talk about. So institutions that are static and don't keep on moving, and this movement is not really only calculated or measured by events or what you're doing. And that's why it's important what I started with saying, this is a very important question for us in Beirut and many institutions in Beirut, not only us. What's gonna happen at this moment in the presence of these cancerous cells, which of course you've had some of them before.
Structure, and maybe be able to operate in a way that Lotus used to work all those years ago. Are you thinking about that position that Beirut had at that time and how you can use that convening power again to bring attention to what's going on there, but also to create solidarities with other parts of the world too?
Thanks. I think what you're talking about, the real estate boom that happened with Hariri, Prime Minister Hariri, and then continued at the moment, has stopped. There is no real estate boom anymore. The city is categorically and dramatically fighting a big economical collapse at any moment, with the lira falling completely apart, like what happened in Turkey. So these people who are very rich and have been very happy with brewing arts, the real estate is not happening anymore. And the museums and the foundations that started, and we were talking about Beirut, about the boom of institutions, foundations, all of that. I think it's a myth. Nothing is happening. There are no museums anymore. Economy is completely pale, and these institutions will not happen. I think what I say again, a more agile structure, maybe again thinking of lunches and thinking of meeting in cafes and thinking of the 90s, and that predominantly, of course, it's going to be very difficult to go back when you have been producing and thinking of temporalities and thinking of economies of production and all of that. But this is a time where it is not a mundus operative operation, but rather connecting to yourself to the political work you are doing. There are sometimes you have resources and you feel and you're well off, and there are sometimes that you're not, and you need to deal with the situation. It doesn't mean that you have to close your doors. You have to think of how I started in the boot of my car. And my boyfriend did shelves for me to put my books inside the car. That was when I used to sit in a cafe with all the artists that many of you are familiar with their work and their practice. So, yes, I think we have to think of different agile formats. I'm not sure how it will be. We're still overwhelmed and thinking about it, but this is something that I think we have changed across the passage of 25 years. We have changed in many ways and formats.
So I had another question. Thank you so much, Kristine. Wonderful that you're here. I sort of, in thinking of exactly that, returning to or going to a different kind of model where you might release yourself from some of the, say, more Marxist structures of capitalism or neo-capitalism, there is still retains the problem of the language of independent, alternative, maybe even agile, having been taken over by grand institutions. Let's think about the Oslo Biennial, talking about itself as agile, experimental, grassroots, which is, operated from the city council.
Mhm.
And I find that, so I would be I would be interested in you maybe thinking about or talking a little bit about how to think in that space where even and work in that space where even our basic notions have, or are losing and being taken over, losing meaning, being taken over by, yeah, larger structures.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, this is a very big thing that you're talking about when we use very loose terms all the time. When I talk about not for profit and all of these structures, how we use them interchangeably and they become the chapeau of everything. But also, what we're doing is really um, doesn't matter. Um, it depends. It doesn't matter that we use them and think about them, but also these terms change with the political urgencies around them. So when like the region in London, you think people, I think the term got usurped, and actually, instead of being that agile body you're talking about, you became an authority than you, because there isn't any museum and there isn't the institution and there isn't the academy. I mean, we did HWP, which is the program, which is a free study program, 10 years ago with the urgency, with all of these artists that like somebody like Walid Rad, somebody like Lina Sana, and Rabia Mroui, Iman Isa, Natasha Sadr Hagagian, Zainab Oz, all of these people. We did it because we were thinking of the education programs in the country that thought of contemporary art as an empty vessel. And that's why we started this. And that's why we're still thinking of keeping these programs for free. So anybody could come to Beirut. We provide these fellows with, it's a program that costs $20,000. It's for free. It's a free study program. We give them stipend. We do all of that. And we still insisting on doing this until the 10th year. And this came with the term of the 90s because our universities completely shunned away and thought of contemporary arts as something that is coming and exported from the West. So all of these terms that we started with has been ejected by the political terms around them and by the toxicity around them. And already they are toxic when we talk about cancerous cells. So in a way, you are dealing with a muffled word that keep changing, especially in our word. What Ashkal Alwan was 25 years ago is not the same. Ashkal Alwan is an authority. So we cannot say we are innocent and we are really like, oh, the monster institution is coming. Oh yeah, and the foundations like Ashti Foundation. No, we are part of this. We gentrified. We're responsible. And we're responsible in a critical way. And that's why, you know, when I thought of Sharjah, I thought of a biennale that is over 2 years, taking 4 cities that I've worked with 4 interlocutors like Zainab Oz, Lara Khalidi, and Qadr Atiyah, and Beirut, as Ashkal Alwan as is, of that, the institution and the temporality that once you change, you start with something. I started with Ashkal Alwan, being the initiator of Sharjah, I ended with a completely different chapter. So these terms are terms that we inject with how we are nuancing the moment around us. And of course, this economy as economy is an economy that is loaded with prejudices and also personal traumas. And that's why we talk about this cancerous and toxicity and living and resurrecting again, not in a Christian sense, but resurrecting in the sense that not when we have a trauma or the country is going through a war, if I happen to be the director of Ashkal Alwan, then the doors will shut down and then we leave because we have lived. And even if we leave, nothing will stop, you know? So this is something that you will pick up, our students in Ashkal Alwan will pick up. So it's this, you know, backfiring at us. So
I think that many of these issues in informal conversations with some of the other participants will come up again with the question of the life and death of institutions. Also, what does this periodicity mean, and how is one complicit in the structures that both support one but that one creates? I'm just going to ask a last question from the audience and ask, it's a big one, so I'll ask for a short response, but maybe it's something to consider even in its framing of terms. What criteria might be useful in evaluating the quote success of such initiatives? And or I take it to be initiatives like Ashkal Alwan or others. And how must a vision or a mission be part of the contextualization of the programming? But this question of success
yeah,
is maybe an interesting one.
yeah. I mean, you become success when you're picked by many international institutions. I don't know if this is success, and maybe this is a you know, maybe this is a curse. I don't know. So success and thinking of success is another term that is very loaded. And this is something that I really have a problem with, efficiency and success coming together. So at least I'm aware that I didn't run Ashkal Alwan with efficiency. I um, I ran it with friends, how we started, and I still continue it to run it very, you know, thinking of everything that is happening in the city, but also taking into consideration that I'm always surrounded by very young people. That part of it is our students who never leave Beirut. They go back to their cities, but they come back all the time. So this is success.
Thank you. Let's have a warm round of applause. So we're going to now move into the second panel, and I'm going to hand over the mic and moderation to Anthony Huberman, who will also be a participant in tomorrow's activities, but Anthony will be moderating this panel now. So thank you.
All right, that was a. Thanks for inviting me to Oslo. This is a really great beginning of a conference, and I think this presentation, Kristine's presentation, I think is going to be very useful and productive for the next section of the conference, which, as you can see here, is titled Institutional Measures, Spatiality, Timing, and Formats. And as Rhea, I think, put it most succinctly in her introduction, it's trying to think about the what and the how, and maybe how those two are related. So I'm not going to say anything more about that because we have very eloquent speakers who are going to speak to it. And I'm also not going to introduce them because you all have their introductions in your program. And but it's 3 spaces. Lulu in Mexico City, with Chris Sharp, and she's going to get us going right away. And then we have the second one will be Kunstverein Amsterdam with Yana. And then finally, Praxis. The order is correct? Yes, with Rhea and Kristine. So without further ado, here's Chris Sharp to introduce Lulu.
Thanks, Rodrigo. Thank you for everything. Thanks for the introduction, Anthony. And that was a very powerful talk. I can't believe I have to follow up on that. That was really impressive. And I think what I'm going to talk about is totally different from what we just heard. And I hope that in itself speaks to the quality of this conference, and that there are really different positions presented and involves. And so I'm going to talk about Lulu. Lulu is a space that I opened in Mexico City with an artist, a Mexican artist, Martin Soto Clement. We opened in April 2013. And I think we opened kind of stupidly. There wasn't much thinking behind it. The reasons and the thinking for the project have gradually become clearer for me over time, and I hope even throughout this conference they'll become clearer still. But I think Martin is a Mexican artist who is from Mexico, travels all over, works more now in Mexico than he did when he opened. But when we opened, he was barely there. I was and still am to a certain degree an independent curator, whatever that might mean. I'm not attached to any institution aside from Lulu. I'm really reluctant to call it an institution. And so there was, I think for both of us, there was this idea, like if we open an institution or we open a space, it will kind of help anchor us in a specific scene to which we can make a sustained contribution and participate on a regular basis. It was really as simple as that. And I think for me, soon after, a part of the impetus in opening it was also initially landing in Mexico City and noticing that there was there's an amazing institutional infrastructure. For those of you who don't know, I mean, there's like over 20 museums you can see contemporary art in Mexico City. And it has a relatively healthy commercial scene, but there were no real artist-run or independent spaces. I went to some shows, and they were mostly like pop-ups in semi-derelict buildings with no real curatorial premise that felt like, I'm amazed to say, hasn't changed that much since Lulu moved there. I think somebody tried to open a cupcake shop at one point for me, which is like the death knell of gentrification. I mean, after Starbucks, but it didn't last. So I don't know how that has happened or hasn't happened, but so we took the living room of the apartment and we inserted a white cube in it, a 9 square meter white cube. So literally built a room within a room. And a big part of that, our thinking behind that was basically that we were encountering, or at least I was encountering, all these spaces where space wasn't even considered. It wasn't really thought about. It was just like, it was just kind of like punk and a mess. And for us, I think we posed ourselves a question of like, what if we build this a white cube that's 9 square meters, which is kind of almost a contradiction. It's like absurd to build such a small space. And like, what can we do with that? And what can we do? And the idea was like to do things as simply as possible. Like our first website, I think, was a Tumblr or something. I mean, we're like, we want to keep things as economic and as simple as possible. And I think we're also coming from, yeah, it's funny, we wanted it to keep it as informal and I guess informal as possible, but at the same time, as professional as possible, to like present the best possible exhibition in a space that's a white cube, and to present artists with the best possible conditions. Our first show was Johann Lempert, German artist, who lives in Hamburg and had never shown in Mexico. And I think that kind of set the tone and the mood of the show, because Jochen is an incredibly important contemporary photographer who still doesn't have enough visibility, but has gone on to receive a lot more visibility. But he's somebody who's working at an institutional level. Like, I think not long before we had the show at Lulu, he had a show at Ludwig in Cologne, for instance. So it's like we were working at a very high level immediately. And then later, as things progressed, in his studio. So if we opened a street side space, it would show a bit more of a commitment to Mexico City and working there. And it became, it was basically an exact replica of the first space. And as things progressed, like our thinking around why we do things, or what we do, why we do what we do, became clearer and clearer. And it's funny, I think one thing that the space became really responsive to Mexico City, and it was responding to, it's funny to go back to that question, alternative and independent, alternative to what, independent of what. I'm reluctant to use those terms as well, but I think Lulu is in many ways an alternative to what exists in Mexico. Mexico and the production of contemporary art in Mexico is largely, for better or for worse, governed by socio-politically engaged conceptualism. And what I mean by that is that form feels secondary to content. And this became something that was really important to Lulu and the kind of choices we were making. We wanted to show art in which form was actually indivisible from content, that it was integral to what a thing was. We also wanted to focus on even medium-specific work. So, for instance, painting. We show a lot of painting in Mexico. We didn't necessarily in the beginning, but it kind of became something that we felt was necessary because no one else shows painting, for example. And in part, and this, there's a lot of debate around why painting is not shown in Mexico, but I think it's seen in part as somehow totally complicit with the art market, the neoliberal art market. It's somehow just like something that is perfectly commodifiable and therefore devoid of political agency or even urgency. Like these are all things that somehow cannot coexist. And part of Lulu's mission, I guess you could say, was to actually really question that and show and actually argue that these are in fact things that can coexist. So it's funny, in terms of like, I guess I should say, so that really leads to an emphasis on the art object, and that leads to an emphasis on like this viewing experience. So it's there, it's not so much a discursive space. I mean, we do catalogs, we've had talks in the past, we've had talks at other local institutions, but for us, like the primary focus are exhibitions, or actually presenting really considered, thoughtful, even clean, well curated, so to speak, exhibitions in the space, and hoping people can come and have that encounter, and also hoping that young artists can come and see that this is an alternative. You know, you can paint and you can think about these things. You can make sculpture. And you can really also think about medium. Again, medium specificity for us, it's very important that artists are, if they're painting, they're thinking really about painting. They're engaging with the history of painting, again, with sculpture, photography, film, whatever. It's never just something that's instrumentalized or used to communicate or impart some ideology or message or what have you. There's something for us that's very important about the art itself. And I really appreciated what Osaka said earlier about silence, because that led me to think like, I mean, this conference is really interesting. It's, you know, continually obliging me to like pose questions to myself. but like that's not something you hear very often. And I identified with that in that people do come to Lulu and we always give guided tours. We have like a reputation in Mexico for always giving a guided tour, for making people feel as welcome as possible whenever we can. But I also like to think of Lulu as a space that actually creates silence. Maybe is not met with silence or mediated through silence, but actually I think of it in terms of a very famous work by Robert Barry, um, which he, that part of the title, it's an empty room, part of the title is a place to which we can come and think about what we're going to do for a little while. So this space of kind of contemplation and a space which it's not necessarily religious or anything like that. There's not a theological component so much as a more kind of existential meditative component. I see that I'm running out of time. There's so much to discuss, but I should talk a little bit about the economy of Lulu as well, because Lulu we initially applied for funding from different funding bodies. We got none of it. We sold a work almost by accident, in spite of ourselves, from our first show, and we realized that we could subsist on a very low economy and started selling work. So we are complicit with the neoliberal paradigm in that respect. And that's, led me to think about how to, it's like, I'm not sure if it's an independent space. At one point I started calling it a hybrid project space, something between a commercial space and a nonprofit. At this point, I think Lulu is just a monster, and that's the way I'm thinking about it. And it's a monster that I think will continue to evolve, and that in itself is something that also asks me or obliges me to pose the question of like how spaces or institutions can evolve. And when I say that, it's like it's a monster. It's like it's not pure in any way. It doesn't want to be a project space necessarily. It doesn't want to be a gallery. I considered that at one point. The moment you start selling something, people are like, oh, this is a gallery now. And then you have to conform to that model. But that model didn't suit us either. And so a question I've had, and the one point I really wanted to respond to was spatiality and formats. I think it's kind of already implied, but for us, the size, the scale of Lulu, which is actually the smallest space in Mexico City, despite us having added a second room, so now it's 21 square meters, is integral to everything about its identity, from small art to the intimate experience, to kind of trying to avoid or resist this idea of the pressure of growth, of expanding, of always scaling up, showing increasingly larger art, and kind of demonstrating that you're somehow growing in terms of kind of neoliberal capitalism, coming bigger and better and more powerful. For us, it's been much more about focusing on a kind of art that is capable of imparting a large important experience despite the modesty of its scale. It looks like I'm officially out of time, so we'll continue the conversation after.
Yeah, that's about right. Hi, everyone. I think, yeah, this is us. My name is Yana. I'm here to represent Kunstverein. We're located in Amsterdam. Kunstverein is a not-for-profit organization. It was started in 2009 by Christ Kruithuizen, who is the current director of KW, sorry, not KV, one more. And Maxine Kopsa, who is our current director. And they started the space in an apartment as well, back in the day, because Amsterdam was going through a cultural crisis, not unlike the one that it's going through now. And they found that there was a need for a space where people could gather and where practices could be shown that were not in their yeah, eyes being addressed. And I think that is still the aim of Kunstverein today. We exist almost 10 years, so let's see where that goes. Um, the aims have always been to show practices by overlooked artists and to show special stories in the sense that, for instance, a little while ago we showed Noah Eshkol, who made a whole theory as a choreographer about movement and how to move through space and how we actually use our bodies. And we showed those practices at a time when, for instance, we find that movement is becoming more and more difficult or mediated. Um, or a show like Joe Gibbons, who is normally a documentary maker, but we showed his drawings made while he was in residence at Rikers because he couldn't support himself anymore as an artist and robbed the bank, which of course opens up a whole idea of um, why do we do the things to do and how do we support ourselves and what happens when we can't support ourselves anymore. Um, so that is one of our main aims. And another thing is, of course, to show these practices in a way that is exciting or steers away from the white cube. We try to surprise ourselves, but also our audience. Um, and I would say it's a little bit, yeah, there's two main things. We have, of course, a space. We started in an apartment, moved to a saxophone shop, and are now currently in a bakery, hidden among the yeah, there you see it, hidden among the commercial galleries and around the corner from Stedelijk Museum. And the reason why we do that is because we can show institutional level shows, but at the doorstep access. So we also have random passerbys, tourists, and as well as very yeah, members of Kunstverein. For every show, we try to rethink the space. So to actually make it the message, part of the message, we make it into a bookshop for Richard Costellanos. We make it into a restaurant for Ben Kimmond. So we don't only change the show, we also change the furniture, we change the functionality of the space. Another thing we do is as well, perhaps it doesn't always need to be a space. So we steer away from that. And sometimes exhibition is a book or an event or as well, no event, but just a hypnotic intrusion into your mind where you can have your own perception of things, which was a show we did with Raimundas Malashauskas a while back as well. Or, yeah. Another main aspect of the things we do is duration. And I think that's very interesting in terms of what I've been asked to speak about, frequency and duration and space. And hopefully we will talk about it a little bit more. But when I was thinking about it, I thought like, okay, there's probably three things in which we can cut it up. The actual duration of an event. How long does something last? Does it always need to follow the institutional 3 months? You have an exhibition and it's open for 3 months or 6 weekends, depending. So almost then as a sort of a loop in your mind, you can stay with the song in your head, and that's it. Or the other side of the on the other side of the spectrum, we had a space which was called Bob's Your Uncle, which lasted almost for 2 years, and where we always did an event every week almost. And the reason why we started the space is then also because we saw that the community was lacking a space where you could actually have a performative element. Or we did a show with Alex Waterman, a solo show of the work he had made, and that was just one event. But the event, the one evening, took on the whole budget of a show. So it doesn't, for us, it doesn't really matter how long something lasts to take it all as serious. So no matter what. I hope this makes sense to you. Then another aspect of time is, of course, when. And I touched upon that a little bit earlier with the Noah Eshkol. But yeah, pick up your telephone and call and be connected to one of the great poets they're not yet so known, and to them, well, via an automatic answering machine. So elaborate that in the show, as I mentioned earlier, to change like the space in the function of the practice that we want to address. We also change the mediums through which you can access the material. So now in this show, you could dial, of course, the phone number and you would be connected to the answering machine and you would hear a poem. Or you could also at certain moments listen to the radio and then hear the records via the radio from the comfort of your own home. You could come to the space and then, of course, play them for yourself, but also for us or anybody else that was in the space, accessing sort of the serendipity of how you would also call in, such as Mia Yu, to interact with the material that was on the records. So I would say that at least in 4 different ways we try to mediate this practice, and this is very sort of essential for New York or Toronto. Though I have to say that the one in New York has been latent a while, because of course. And what I was thinking about earlier today when we were thinking about spaces and sort of why they need to be there, I do think for Kunstverein it's very important to have an anchor in the city. What we notice in our city is that it's turning into some sort of magic fairy tale. There's a lot of tourists. And everybody, the rents are super skyrocketing high, and everybody's being pushed to the outskirts of the city, including the art spaces. We are centered in the center of the city on the canals. And I think it's very important to be part of that urban fabric and not to be pushed to the periphery. And we'll try to aim that. Also to not lose this space, because in a way it is good for people to have an anchor point in mind, to have a space to come to. Perhaps I should also tell you something more about our publications. The publications that we make is an umbrella to kind of overflow. To overflow these different sister locations we have. So the books that we make in Kunstverein Amsterdam get distributed by Idea Books, but so do the books that got made in Milan or Toronto. And we do imagine the book as an exhibition space. We, for instance, made a book with Rhea Dall, or a series of books with Rhea Dall, about the abstract creationist Marlowe Mas, and we're currently making one about Grace Crowley, which are again underlit people in the course of history. And we think sometimes the best way to mediate what they were doing is just by showing it to you in the pages of a book, not necessarily on a wall or in a conversation. I think this might have been very messy, but I'm very open to questions and that might help. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kristine Siegel. I don't have to introduce Rhea. I think you've all met this lovely creature by now. And I can honestly say, following up on what Osaka said earlier, that our friendship has a lot to do with the fact that Rhea knows her way around power tools. That's at least a very important thing for me. Don't tell here. So if anyone needs help, we started PRAXES in, well, I should say, our fantasy name. I've been so inspired by the talks today. I've completely changed my talk. I'll just talk about everything you said and incorporate it as we go. Our fantasy name was PRAXES Center for Contemporary Art. And Praxis was really what we wanted to call it, but because of funding structures and becoming a charity and under German law, we had to be Center for Contemporary Art. We started it in Berlin in 2013 after a year of talking and having conversations with all sorts of people, and ran it until 2015, where we decided we were invited to be part of the Bergen Assembly 2016. So we closed down our space in Berlin and moved everything to Norway and spent, well, the biennial or the triennial was a full year. We decided to do it over a full year, but we spent at least better part of 2 years up there, I would say, something like that. And that was that was the conclusion of our run together for now. But a big part of what we've been doing as Praxis is really finishing each other's sentences. So we're going to do this sort of back and forth where if we start interrupting each other, that's totally the way that we work. Go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it even extended to that kind of intimacy, I guess, between the two of us, even extended to Christina's 3 kids, calling me mom's wife. So, but yeah, so starting Praxis and thinking about these the measures came out of different desires. One was to have both been in a way employed in these bigger institutions, and having worked on the 5-year plan, the fundraising, the 2 shows you got to install, the catalog coming up, the deinstall and transport, the insurance, all the organizational back end work of this, the website, the thinking of the graphic design and onwards, and sometimes running so fast that there was not much of a content discussion going on any longer. So that was one little problem I think we were both thinking about. Another problem, which was not so much, we're both from the creature curator side, but from the artist side that we saw was, of course, the fact that if that's the case, then the artists are the ones to run around with the little rucksack of knowledge about their work and installing their work, and in effect being their own context and curatorial conversation and feedback. And so that was another little thing to think about. And then, of course, another thing when working with, and I guess that might be happening for you in many of your institutional context, is that when you open, like on the opening night, it's when you have that glass of wine that you realize that there is this piece from 1993 that you just didn't know about. And it's actually in the attic in the adjacent house. And you just didn't incorporate it in the show. So in a way, the understanding there's a particular blindness that we, in so many ways, when we do shows, are not incorporating in them, like being very straightforward and honest about, they hold within them, but also trying to react to. So that was some sort of more overall incentives. And then there were a few incentives of the very site, like Berlin being a city of enormous capacity when it comes to artists and agents within the art world, thinkers, fellow curators and onwards, but having very few places to think about institutions together. Because at least back when we founded Praxis in Berlin, it's based in Berlin, we found that there weren't many institutions of mid-size that had a real program, an artistic statement to come with. So wanting to speak to all of these people and seeing little facilities for that.
So what was Praxis? We had this fantastic former Catholic church that we were able to move into, and the concept was really simple.
But we have now. I'm gonna finish your sentence. Catholic church, and thinking of what Yana said about the, what was it? So first the apartment, then the saxophone shop, and then the bakery. This was a former, like the space we were in was the former community house of this Catholic Gemeinde.
That's right. So very simple concept: 2 artists at a time, 6 months, where the public would have access to the investigation. Of course, the investigation itself ran longer than 6 months, but really what it came down to was that we wanted to spend longer time working with one practice. And this, of course, sounds like putting the sort of bringing the artist back on this romanticized pedestal, and it was to a certain degree. That's often where it started. Like, look at all this work that this person has done. I've only seen a fraction of it. There must be so much more. But really, a lot of what happened in the space was dealing with a kind of, how to put it, a penumbra of the artwork. We would start with the artwork and then sort of move into the weird shadows that were cast around it, and use it as a catalyst to have a lot of conversations about things that were happening just around it with people that were not necessarily involved in the project. Well, that would sort of be the first circle, would be talking to people who had worked with the artist before. The artist was totally involved in every single process as a curator, as an archivist, and then moving to the next layer, inviting curators and historians, art historians, whatever, whoever had worked with that person before, communities that they had taken part in, and then the next layer out, journalists, anthropologists, psychologists, whatever we needed to unpack the work. And we allowed ourselves a certain amount of anarchism, I would say, anarchy in this process, that we would allow ourselves to fall into weird rabbit holes. And we talked about the praxis not just as this body of work, followed by this body of work, followed by this body of work, but as the whole process of unfinished proposals, collaborations, sketches, material investigations that go nowhere, all these sort of things. We really decided to just say, all of this stretch of time where the artist has been working, that's what we're dealing with. And of course, the question is then, how do you present that to a public? The way we decided to do it is very much along the line what Yana was saying earlier. We didn't really think that a particular work needed 3 months. We would always ask ourselves, does this need 2 months? Does it need 2 days? Does it need a full 4 months out of the 6 months that we have? What is it? How long do we need to present a work? So that meant that every cycle, we called them cycle, every 6 months, we would start from scratch and try to design to some degree how would these 6 months pan out, but with the knowledge that as we would go along and accumulate knowledge and people around us that would know something, we would change this. And that really meant that we started out with a plan, fully knowing that it would never really come to happen the way that we had decided, which was totally fine. It was totally okay. And that, of course, also meant that we had certain parameters in place to say, we will work with exhibitions, we will have publications. We called them, Rhea, what do we call them?
Parlors.
No.
No, the publications.
Yes.
Oh no, we call them papers.
Papers,
Sorry,
oh, sorry.
and I should say, like, I was just looking at the time, but we should say when saying that, very importantly, that of course Cassandra is here,
our editor who worked with us for the entire time. So a big part of what we did was moving between exhibitions, publications, and the parlors, which was all sorts of talks that could take any kind of format, and really did. And we decided very early on, we're not interested in doing something where we have to have a full house every time. It's totally okay to have a super nerdy talk where there's only 5 people. You don't have to come to this group therapy session with Jutta Kötter if you absolutely hate the concept. We decided very early on, everything is not going to be for everyone. That's totally fine. This is, in the same way we decided that I might like parts of this exhibition and Rhea hates it. That's totally fine because we have time. We'll move on, we'll accumulate, we'll see what we have. And so our audiences also grew over the 6 months as people got interested. And then we saw completely different people the next 6 months. But what happened during the 6 months, and it's almost your turn, I promise, would be, because I really like this idea as well of the silent exhibition, because I find it really hard to walk into a space and actually respond to it immediately. So what would often happen would be that after a few months, somebody would come back and be like, I've been thinking about what I saw here 2 months ago and I really didn't like it. Or I'm a musicologist and the way you used that word was completely wrong, whatever. And that became part of the process. So we would invite people in to come and give a talk, whatever they had a knowledge about. And that to me, personally, and professionally, was really a really big part of the process. I don't think I've ever been able to do this sort of feedback loop in any of my other jobs before. Okay.
But
should I give an example? I'll give a quick example. one of the people that we worked with for 6 months was Matt Mullican. How do you deal with somebody like Matt Mullican, who's had tons of shows, is quite well known? So this is not somebody where you're necessarily digging things out. Well, we decided to go back and look at his some of his really early work, and we started to look at to transcribe his performances. Maybe you know that he has these sort of hypnotic performances, and just looking at it as text became the first part of the process. Looking at the whole idea of third person, and for him, he was in the process at the time working on a new performance, completely new performance material. He was super nervous about how to deal with it, how to present it, because it was unresolved, and how do you put it in? And he had all these big museum shows coming up. And over the 6 months, as we went through different parts of his work, we returned to some of the. He had one evening where he performed all his old performances from the 70s, and over the course of time, he felt safe enough to present it not as a finished performance, but as something in progress to an audience. And to me, this is where it becomes interesting as well institutionally, because it's not so much for me about teasing out the alternative or the radical. It's really about understanding complexity by descending into the particular. Simply saying, okay, we're not trying to make experiments all over. We're trying to do this one particular experiment here, and then we go on to something else, and then we go on to something else. So it's more a slow turning machinery of particulars, if that makes sense.
And I think we then, so just to say a few, I think we can light out a few things that we could add, both of us, to that. But one of them being that then going into that super particular loophole or rabbit hole of an artistic practice included a certain kind of marriage, not only between us, but obviously between us and the artist and the work. And that included, or that sort of had its different curves of both honeymoons and certain kind of down periods, but in certainly one of the important things that we learned, or that we had hoped also to see from that was that creating exhibitions, working with exhibitions, because we actually per se did not work with new productions. Matt's new production was a thing that sort of came up, but working with exhibitions in that format is in itself a production and productive and a part of the practices we work with. So even though we would revolve around existing work, there would be so much, in a way, new or other material surfacing along the way. So a kind of slow cooking, but then marathon running to do so, very importantly. So while we were saying 2 artists for half a year, there was an enormous intensity, a kind of beast of its own making, which maybe also became in part the end of it, because funding something like PRAXES in Berlin, that is a very impoverished city, was not an easy task. We found money by all means, one of them being at the Danish Arts Council that had never funded something outside its borders before. But of course, the main body of funding into this whole creature was the blood, sweat, and tears of everyone involved, which is why it's so important to talk about Cassandra, who's here, our graphic designer, Chiara Figone, and all the other people involved. So, but yeah, so working highly intensely, and then having at some point an institutional invitation that made a kind of escape route / change of modality. That was the Bergen Assembly, and we could talk lots about that kind of transition, but I don't think we have time to do that now. But one thing that became part of that half year kind of marriage marathon running was also to try and break down what you could call professional habits, and that being in a way these very classical working modalities we all often sort of incorporate silently, sort of how the press release should look, how we should always have the 6-month program ready in advance, and to try and work against that and maybe think that there's a possibility of actually really not knowing, and that can be really good.
I think we should stop, shouldn't we?
Should stop.
Rodrigo, shouldn't we? All right. Thank you so much.
right, thank you. I'd like to invite everyone to do two things. These four people to sit down, and all of you to jot some questions down on the note cards that might still be hovering around the auditorium. And I will happily then be reading from them later on. Okay. Yeah. So thank you all for some really rich presentations that gave a really good overview of distinct but definitely interrelated positions in terms of how to think through what institutions are, how they work, and why they function the way that they do. I'm going to try to start off maybe by trying to bring in some running vocabulary that have come up already earlier this morning, and maybe to start with thinking about this question of the alternative, or I guess I'd start by saying if this topic, the kind of subcategory here, is thinking about the how. I think that's something that characterizes all three of these spaces that I'd like to kind of focus in on and ask you guys to talk a little bit more about. You know, just taking a brief historical parentheses, one way to think about the history of alternative spaces, at least I'll talk about it specifically from the history that I'm most familiar with, which is the American one. You know, in the beginning of the alternative art movement in the late 60s and early 70s, it really began as a way to create an alternative place to show a type of work that was not being shown in a commercial gallery or at large-scale institutions. So there was a type of artist at that time doing performance work, doing institutional critique later on, doing things that were somehow incompatible with the commercial context or the museum context. And so therefore there became a reason to exist. We need a place that can show things that are not shown elsewhere. I think today we've come to a place where that is slightly more complicated, because a lot of as we've been talking about, a lot of very mainstream organizations are showing quote unquote difficult, critical, challenging work. And as we've also been talking about, a lot of very mainstream organizations are using words like disruption and experimental and innovation as a ways to describe what they do, even if they're the Whitney Museum. And so we have a question here around the what. So then one thing that I think that the three examples here, the three of you point to, is that maybe there's a question around thinking through an alternative, not an alternative type of art to show, or not only that, but also an alternative way to work with artists. And I think there's three different things I wanted to just start off with. I think on one hand, in Amsterdam, the Kunstverein, there's this alternative, or thinking about how an institution can change its function, right? Which I think is a really interesting. It can become a restaurant. It can become a bookstore. It can become a whatever. There's the question of, I think how Rhea and Kristine are talking about it, where the institution can change in terms of the how they work, change what an exhibition is. You know, thinking about how an exhibition can be episodic or a chapter or deconstructed in this way across time that might not be figured out ahead of time. And then in a beautifully perverse way, Chris's proposal of changing, actually, you're re-incorporating things that previously might be considered, you know, the canon, the painting, the sculpture, and so and reintroducing the conversation to be had around reinserting the white cube into a living room and what that means. So I just wanted to ask you to respond maybe a bit to this question around changing the we're changing the function of place, we're changing what an exhibition can be in terms of time structures, and we're changing the kind of presumption around the alternative is the anti-white cube.
Of the white cube, to a certain degree. And I mean, Lulu's, it's full of contradictions, as somebody was saying earlier. it's a parody, and it's also very hyperbolic. A lot of what it does, the fact that it strives for such perfection with such limited and modest means, is kind of ridiculous. I mean, it's always kind of on the border of uh, the ridiculous and the, you know, taking itself utterly, often probably too late. And in terms of like, I do think it is productive and important. I mean, I've had artists come from different parts of Mexico. For instance, I remember this one kid early on, we gave Elisa Niesenbaum, a great Mexican painter, one of her first solo, like mature solo exhibitions. She was in not the current Whitney Biennial, but the last one. And things have changed a lot for her. But, and until then, there wasn't really a forum. There wasn't a place for her to have this kind of exhibition. And we had this kid come, and he sat there for like 3 hours, like looking at the show. And I finally approached him, and I was like, "Wow, I'm really amazed. You're looking so closely." And then he told me he was from Guadalajara. He'd been following our program very closely online, and for him, it was amazing to be able to come and see this kind of work and this space in Mexico, which until then you couldn't really see.
Yeah, I think with us it's also some sort of going back through a pre white cube situation. So something I didn't mention in the talk earlier is that Kunstverein in part is funded by members. So in a way, it's also a place where you come together as a community. So it's also a little bit, it's not a one-trick pony. Not every show needs to change its functionality. It's not that we always need to become something else, but it is also a vessel to bring quite complicated art theory or a quite complicated practice to a level that, yeah, that it feels like a friendly space that anybody can approach into, and that you, I mean, maybe you saw it in the picture that we have of our front door, but even the step is sort of worn down. So we try to make it as accessible as possible. Yeah.
I think there is a kind of poison in the whole discourse around opposition and the alternative that I think is quite. We early on we talked about we don't want to write this kind of poison into our bylaws. No, you don't. It's a little bit like it's a fantasy battle, just like you have a fantasy name. For me, it was important, and I think for both of us, it was important to start with a kind of positivity rather than writing ourselves up against something that might not be a battle that's actually all that real, because we love institutions and there's all these things that we want to steal from them. So I'd say rather than think about how we sort of pushing up against all sorts of things, it was more a question of like, who are we standing on the shoulders of? And there's a lot of amazing art academy projects, like free university projects that we looked at. We looked at your project, Anthony, of course. The Artist Institute was really important for us, but also just like, how do artists structure their lives? Of course, what we are doing is very similar to a kind of, you just go to work every day, and then you work on this, and then you work on that, and then, you know, not every day you find something amazing, but you just keep going, right? So that was, I think when you start, when you have all things in the first moment when you start something, and you see the sort of great open, you can look back and look at all the things that came before you and take the best, sort of Aristotle, look at everything and keep the best. Or you can look at your immediate surroundings, and of course we did that too. As I was saying, we looked at what is the landscape like, but it's so difficult anyway to predict how your immediate landscape will change, right? So if you start inscribing yourself into these kind of, into the wars that are going on, or the opposition, or you're part of an alternative scene, and but you, because I think you will, as Kristine was saying, you will become part of an authority in a city, in a discourse, if you keep going. And so I think it's really, this is what I take with me from this project, that it's much more interesting to steal and beg and borrow from other people than to try to do something else than what they did.
And then I think there was I think the question of radicality became a little bit of a kind of our own little trap in a way, in for instance, the sort of mere fact that the first article that was written about the first cycle we did with Jutta Kuta and Jared Byrne completely trashed Praxis, hating it because we were not sitting in circles on the floor. And we did actually have white cube-ish spaces for each artist. So there was this infusion of the idea of where radical lies, which has a very, I think, in a way, very conservative flatness to it in Berlin. So now if there's any Berliners out there, they can just like come hit me. But and so in a way, working with talking about different temporalities and also differences, parting to some extent, but maybe more in the particular, was also a kind of a danger, a sort of slippery slope into being misunderstood as a particular idea of radical or radicality that we certainly were not intending to inhabit.
I think something that I think occurs in all projects again, and also going to what Kristine said about really committing oneself to something specific. I think something that's really specific in all of your projects is this relationship to artists. Like sometimes this question around curatorial methodology has a tendency to overrun and dominate what artists are doing, where sometimes artists get kind of thrown into being put into having to perform according to an institutional ideological model, and the how of that the institution wants to work kind of determines what an artist can do. And I think in all of your cases, the fact that the Kunstverein is willing to give if the artist, if that's the nature of what they want or what their project needs, that the Kunstverein says, yeah, of course we'll give you a whole budget for 9 minutes. And same thing for you guys, this ability for Praxis, this notion that there's particular specific things that these artists have done that you're learning about, things that don't ever get included in particular retrospectives, and things, there's something specific to each artist that kind of generates this need to unroll it over time. And then same again, or not same, but differently, but also very invested in Chris's project of being able to give this space to show art in a major metropolitan center that incredibly are not extending invitations to art, to a particular type of artist. So I wondered if you could speak more about this relationship to artists, I guess, simply, this placing institutional models alongside a relationship to artists.
Well, with us, quite often up until now, it's been the case that the artists that we work with are either deceased or very, very old. And that brings a whole different like problematics with them, in the sense that you don't always have the artist there to ask, is this the way you want to do it? If you're doing an archive show, sometimes it's up to you and the estate to open up the material, and opening up an archive is a skill in itself. And I think that's where the mediation through functionality quite often comes in. Yeah, and other than that, yeah, I mean, if we do work, sometimes and I think now in the future, because Kunstverein is now sort of at a pivoting moment in its history, which I think I'm a bit thrown off by the earlier talk as well, because it's true that if you stay stable the entire time and you just do what you're doing the whole time, then you're gonna lose it. Then you're gonna have a major decline in quality as well. And I think what has been good about our program, and also will continue hopefully in the future, is the willingness to change and adapt, and to look at the landscape and see, okay, this is what is actually missing in our landscape, both nationally and internationally. And then as soon as you see that somebody is picking up on that, to move away from that immediately, without guilt, actually. So maybe the white cube all of a sudden becomes a living room again.
I think in a way, in that sense, maybe coming back to this notion of incorporation that Kristine also talked about, there was, you could almost say that there was a wish on the end of Praxis for us to become incorporated and franchised into the bigger museums. And they haven't really done that yet, unfortunately, but I can still hope. But there was, so in a way, or hoping that the Berlin landscape would change so that we would become obsolete. So there was no kind of idea that we would stay around forever. We actually set out with saying we would be there for 3 years. We then ended, and we had written that into the bylaws of the organization because of the simple belief that long-term directorship can really end up killing exactly the potential of the change. And anyway, so we had to inscribe and outscribe ourselves of the institution from the beginning. But that was one thing. But the other thing I wanted to say about working with the artist is that we obviously intended to, you touched upon this earlier, but intended to, in a way, say clean slate, and then like every half year for every artist, 2 artists at the same time, but different for every artist. The temporalities would be different. Also, the spaces would be different. We would, in a way, talk about this malleability of the institution. And this is one of the words that is now said in every second sentence of the Oslo Biennial. So that's just a note to self. But we were trying to be a malleable institution to the artist. And I think that worked to some extent. And then actually what happened, which I think was really interesting on our end, it was that, we started out as a full-blown experiment. Like we literally didn't really know how long we would last. There was a cliff we would fall off after 1 year, maybe after 1.5. Then we got some crowdfunding sources in. It was like very precarious in so many ways. But what also happened is that, so anyway, so we didn't know so much about longevity. But what we saw happen over the 2 years was that we, in a way, I think, institutionalized. We found out what worked well. So the dream of the clean slate, in a way, we didn't want to be, in a way, which was also one of the reasons that the invitation to go to Bergen and try out working with lesser artists for longer time in a very different. Fewer artists, not less, fewer artists for a longer time. Was interesting.
Yeah, yeah. For me, it's interesting. We don't actually. Lulu, in the end, is a really curatorial project. In many respects, like I almost see Lulu as an exhibition, which is to say like a linear group exhibition, which is curated by me. And that has numerous implications. Sometimes I will invite an artist and I will go to them and I'd be like, I want to show this specific body of work. Like with B-Words, we had this beautiful B-Word show and I knew there was this one piece and this other body of work, which would be perfect for Lulu. And I went to B and I was like, I want to do a show and this is what I want to show. And he was like, fantastic. I don't have to think at all. You're in charge. But then we did a show with Manfred Bernice. And the discussion I had with Manfred Bernice was like, I don't normally talk with curators. I just do what I want, And I was like, all right, the space is yours, So, but a lot of the time it is, it is kind of following the format of like this group exhibition, and a group exhibition that accumulates a context and value over time, where I see like if we're working with a more established artist, something happens where they modify the meaning of the program in general, such that where a younger, more emerging position like Elisa Niesenbaum at the time can come along and really benefit from being in this kind of context while enriching it herself. So there are different ways, I guess, give and takes that take place.
I want to just zero in also just on this question of language, which I also think is a kind of running theme here, with a really almost straightforward question, and see if it's possible to answer it in a really straightforward way. And this is inspired by something Chris said in his presentation, where he said that he's reluctant to call it an institution, and came up with a pretty good word to basically the answer to this question already, which is basically, what do you call yourself? And your answer is a monster.
That's Lulu. I might be a
Right.
monster too.
But it's like, that's what I mean. Like, what do you know? It's not a, if words like museums, gallery, institutions, like what do you call yourself? Oh, we're not a gal. Like, what do you just call yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I kind of already answered this question, but I was talking with Joao and Luis earlier, and I know for us, like, we're definitely not an institution, because I think an institution, what makes an institution is that it can be handed over. Like, it can be, it develops an infrastructure and the identity.
It's a name, first of all, that I inherit a structure. It's a peers. But yeah, it's a little bit difficult because we now exist 10 years. And of course, when Kristine started it, they started it, and there were no expectations. There were no, nobody knew what they were going to pull out of their heads, basically. And now we're 10 years further, and we did a lot of shows, and some people know of our program, and that makes it more tricky.
Hello,
Yeah.
we're back. So we were an institution very intentionally, but that was really because we were interested in understanding all the infrastructure. I mean, for me, it's super interesting to write bylaws. All these sort of things to me are super interesting. It's super important. So, I really considered it part of the exhibition practice to think about what does it mean that we've written these bylaws, but now we say clean slate. So which one of them do we have to change, and how do we what has to be visible and what has to be, or what is invisible in this particular cycle? The same with other types of infrastructure in the house, the voice of the exhibition, which I think we'll talk about again tomorrow, which I think is super interesting with the people that are here, because we have such different voices in our output to the world. So we decided to operate as if we were big and important and would stay forever, simply to take the infrastructure important, fully knowing that this was not going to be the case. In the transition to Bergen, though, had to work with other institutions, which I was talking to somebody about yesterday, which is really interesting when you try to approach other institutions as if they're artists. In our case, working with artists is like, come work with us. This is super exciting. We want to learn all about you. Show us all your archives. How do you want to work? How can we? And they're like, here are the keys. We're already so overworked and tired. So here are the keys to the space. It's okay, you can have it, right? So a lot of things happened there where we became something else than an institution. So.
I think there was a realization in the sort of institution, which was that, and this maybe comes back to the kind of foundation of it, that it was an institution that we then, like, at some point realized it's really driven by our passion. We hadn't managed to, and we had hoped to manage within the 2 years to establish the kind of infrastructure that would have been able, so that we would have been able to pass it on. So in a way, there was an intention or hope that, setting out with some kind of imaginary talking institutions, that could maybe manifest itself. That was not the ecosystem in Berlin at that point, even though we shot at everything that moved. Was not ready or couldn't bear or couldn't uphold that, at least financially, yeah. There was lots of sort of audience energy the other way. I think that was what happened.
Yeah, I quickly want to add something to that as well, if possible, if that's all right. I mean, there's also something very interesting about like playing institution when you're just, in your case, 2 people, in our case, 3 people and a designer and somebody who helps with the, there is actually, you cannot be an institution. You're too small to be an institution, but there's to sort of cave that out from the inside out and see how far you can go. I mean, if I would need to give you my business card, it could say director, but it also says cleaning lady. It also says bartender. I mean, yeah. From the bottom up.
I wanted to. I'm going to. A lot of these questions actually are. First of all, it's amazing and interesting to see that they are a huge amount of overlap between them and overlap between what we're talking about, which a lot of them really revolve around this question around, that we started off with. I think is becoming a theme, which is just how can we claim independence with regards to whether it's the format that we're choosing or the people that we're working in the context of mainstream institutionalization of a lot of these same vocabularies and these same methods, like the Oslo Biennial and the Bergen Assembly, inviting you guys, for example, and how. One question specifically wants to, goes to the financial side of this, which is, how does an independent, in quotes, institution avoid classical mainstream institutionalization / stagnation, yet continue subsisting in an economic climate that is ill prepared to financially support seemingly experimental models?
Well, we shut down.
Answer questions, and the question answered. Yeah.
We sell art. We sell art. Basically, we don't. We're fully self-supporting through our own contributions. We don't apply for money. I mean, we also have the luxury of being in Mexico City, where I think you would laugh at our overhead if I told you. So it's, kind of, we don't need that much to subsist.
We have a very interesting financial structure, I would say. We're largely funded by the AFK, which is the city. They support us for like 2/3 of our structural income. Then we have private funding, and we support a lot on our members. And it's because of those members that we have a platform where we can actually have a little bit of freedom to also again go into and against the these funding applications are a bit tricky because you apply for one thing, but then you end up writing a whole educational program all of a sudden that you actually didn't or there's so many demands that are asked of you in funding applications that sometimes it's easier to not get funding and to just do whatever you want to do, and that can actually be a relatively small budget as well. And we get that moving space through our members. And apart from that, I would say also, we have tried to come up with self-sustainable models, such as the bar, which was never, for profit.
Other question beyond the other, I wonder if there's things that have been said in the conversation here that have provoked any other question. Yeah.
So I have a question about this word malleability. Recently, over the last few years, there has been a lot of critique about this one-size-fits-all model. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about the difference maybe for you between malleability, having this kind of responsive method of working, and this idea that you are hosting spaces that can host anything. That, you cover your performance aspect, then you cover this painting aspect, and then you cover this, and then
sharp, and it's about Lulu. And I think it's more, I'm thinking about how you talked about Lulu come about as you wanted to be a sustained contribution to an art scene where there was not a particularly strong artist-run scene. And I don't live in Mexico City, but I've had some engagements with the art scene over the past years, and I've never seen such an art scene. With such a rich alternative art scene, lots of artist-run institutions, and many of them which started before Lulu. And even back in '94, you had Panaderia with Joshua Ocon, for example, or SOMA, which is an independent arts education institution. or even we can consider the Zapatistas coming about, or for the public eye in '94 as some sort of an independent, artist institution. And many other who doesn't necessarily have a space. So I'm going to try to get to a question, but I wanted to clarify these things. And also you said that you wanted to be an alternative to the socio-political engaged conceptualization of conceptualism that where form was secondary to content. And I really would debate that. And because what I've been seeing of the art world exactly in Mexico City and maybe also Mexico is that you have this really array of initiatives that goes from activism to art in like different, in different ways, and that responds to a social urgency in different ways. And I think I want to bring in something that Kristine talked about, or maybe I'm even projecting a bit, but thinking about that different times of social urgency kind of demands different responses. And I try to tie that back into the idea of the alternative, and also thinking about why do we need alternatives? Like really, do we need an alternative just for the sake of the alternative? And shouldn't we have a responsibility of actually respond to the context, what the site wants or what the city wants, and not just what the space wants? And it's not that I'm not opposed to the fact that we sell art, but when you're saying that Lulu is a monster and you're complicit in the neoliberal, I don't know if you said paradigm, but I'm thinking about a neoliberal conversion that has taken place in Mexico with like really grave consequences in terms of land rights, femicides, many, many things. Just, I think if you want to be a monster, like what is that monster going to do? How are you going to deal with that? Do we need that monster? And really, do we need an alternative just for the sake of being an alternative? I don't know if this is a clear question. Maybe it's just, I was just provoked, but I wanted to throw it in there.
No, there's early 2000s. SOMA does not actually show art. The Zapatistas are active in southern Mexico and not Mexico City. And at the time when I arrived, there actually was one really interesting space called, what was it called? It was called Preteen in Mexico City. And I love this guy. He's amazing. His program was queer post-internet before anyone was doing queer post-internet. And he closed eventually. And about the time that Lulu opened, a number of other spaces mushroomed up with totally different identities. There's one called Bikini Wax, which has become quite well known. And I really liked what they were doing in the beginning because they were constantly making exhibitions of themselves and their peers and focusing on work. Contra SOMA, which is actually SOMA is the reason I'm in Mexico. I went there to do a curatorial residency. It was interesting, but up until maybe, I don't know, quite recently, the artists didn't even have studios. So there's no practice. There's only discursive or theoretical content or presentation. So the idea of an art object existing, period, or being able to contain or impart some kind of political content was all but verboten. Like this just, and a studio practice was like almost looked down upon. So I really applauded the fact that Bikini Wax, they were actually making exhibitions. They, since no longer make exhibitions, they generally have talks and have, I don't know, panels and kind of pedagogical forums and so on and so forth. So they've all but abandoned the art object. And then there are others that follow similar models. Many have closed, and I don't know. Lulu's not going to save anyone. You know, like a small art space isn't. It's just like it's just not going to happen. I mean, it's problematic, and this is something I wanted to touch upon. I didn't touch upon earlier, but I'm at least, along with Rhea and Kristine, the only person, or I think there's one other person in the conference who runs a space that's not in their home country. So this comes with all sorts of baggage, right? And there's like two ways I can approach that, and I've seen others approach it, where I could go to Mexico and try and save it, right? I could build a community center, and like, and this would, you know, this, this would not be imperialistic at all. It's like that's somehow my duty or something. But I actually see this as enormously imperialistic, because I think there are all sorts of different Mexicos within Mexico. There isn't just, you know, drug war things, but there are also other things. And I think things like that kid coming from Guadalajara, along with many other artists, this is amazing. A lot of the time I have doubts about that purpose. As a lot of time I ask myself questions similar to what you just asked me, like maybe, you know, I'm just like an interloper here or what have you. But I don't know, for the moment, I still feel like it does serve a specific purpose, and it is an alternative to what is basically a stereotype, you know, because that is a stereotype. That's a cliche. The socio-politically engaged conceptual artist. Like, it's like you say this, and people just think that all Latin American artists do this. You know, this is like, that equals Latin American art production. And I know a lot of really interesting Latin American artists whose work is not embedded in language before they actually make what they're doing. So hopefully that answers your question.
I think we have just thank you. A minute, maybe one last question. Do we have time for one last question?
Yeah, it's the question for all of you. I mean, I can just shut up. Okay, thank you first for the conference and all these talks. I would like to connect a little bit to the discussion we had this morning. Oh yeah, we had this morning. I could follow on the live stream. Thanks for the service, by the way. What is, or how could you describe your relation, the three of you or the four of you for the three projects, to the neighborhood? And I mean, and what is, or what do you think your role in the neighborhood is? I mean, Chris and Yana, you spoke briefly about the neighborhood, and then Rhea spoke about the city of Berlin rather than about the neighborhood. But I found that in particular interesting since it's not inscribed as obvious in your programs as in the projects which were presented this morning.
Thank you.
So we were in Jörg sharing Berlin. So we were in, at this point, actually at the factual geographic center of Berlin. There was like 100 meters up the street, there was this bronze plaque saying that this was the factual geographic center. We were very excited about that. In Kreuzberg. And the neighborhood, Kreuzberg, probably for many of you will ring, sort of gentrified and culturally vibrant and whatnot. But we were actually on the brink of some projects and bordering sort of a more residential part of Kreuzberg. So between two, like Hallische Tor and Cottbuser Tor in a way. So I think that in a way, much along the lines of what Kristine said before, we in terms of being in that particular location, we performed part of the sort of gentrifying community. Also being, we took up the lease we had was a rental contract with Johann König, who is now in the same complex with his huge gallery. So when he came in, we moved out. And that neighborhood is slowly changing. But so just to say that I think that in a way, what happened then is that we became a destination wedding. So in terms of having visitors, it was mainly people who had traveled at least a little within Berlin, which is a geographically rather large city, to come to us, and then came with time. And that was a very beneficial audience exchange, I think, along the lines of what Chris was saying before. We basically had this, like, we thought when we opened the space, we thought we would go to the first Bergen Assembly and see it, and we couldn't move because we had visitors coming in all the time and talking with us. And we were talking with them, and they, of course, proved much better experts on both Gerhard Byrne and Jutta Köter at that point than we were at the beginning of the cycle. So there was a huge exchange, I think, with the Berlin arts community. What wasn't a huge exchange was the immediate surroundings. Well, because mainly we called PRAXES in Berlin, in Germany, a general practitioner, a doctor, is called, the name of having a general practitioner's clinic is called a PRAXES. So people would basically enter and ask what we would cure or heal. And that was fantastic. We did think a lot about that, but we didn't cure a lot of local people. Someone asked to use our front garden, and we in a way actually said yes to that, but that never really happened. And then there was the kind of occasional passers-by that would enter the space or be provoked or whatnot, but there was not that much exchange with that local community. And certainly in terms of thinking of funding structures, we didn't have the money nor the extra capacity of creating some sort of outreach program, though it would have been really interesting, of course, to know beyond the neighbor who stopped every party at 10, what the neighbors did think of having this space.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you want to add more to what you guys said?
Oh, yeah, we can go, but do we have time?
1 minute.
Okay. I find this a very difficult question, and I always find it a very difficult question. Because I know that the right answer would be, yes, of course, the neighbors come and everybody loves us and we do a lot of activities together, but that's just not the case. I mean, just like not everybody will go and watch football, not everybody likes what we do. I hope and I believe that, in fact, sometimes the things we do rub them the wrong way. As I said earlier, Amsterdam is a little bit of a Disneyfication of what a society is. We sometimes people that come and shut us down at 7 o'clock in the evening because they want their peace and quiet on a Friday evening in the city. And then I do hope that our presence being there kind of also, maybe not in the right way, interacts always, but also kind of, gives elbow space to life in a city. So that's one thing. And then, of course, the other thing is we are a verein, which means that we are a community. And we have an active community of people that come, like at PRAXES, like in Lulu, like other non-profit and organizations that are here, that there are people that specifically come to you. And yeah, I also don't think that's unimportant. And also, I don't think there's such a thing as real independence, because you always have colleagues. Look at this. But also, I think a lot of the things why we do what we do is because we fill in where the other ones are not doing it. But you're not alone. Of course, you're not.
Thank you. I think a lot of us are, at least myself, are both watch football and visit Kunstverein. So thankfully, there's enough of us who do both of those things. So thank you to the panelists. I want, just in the spirit of I love how things the glue that starts gradually happening at these kinds of conferences where things roll back in. So maybe I thought I would leave everyone as you're having coffee to think about a question, applying the same question that was asked earlier today to this group, which is, especially because the title here is institutional measures, is to think about how does one, in the case of these three projects, how does one measure success? And how does one measure impact? Super difficult question to answer. So we will all answer it for each other over coffee.
Thank you.
But it was like, but no, it's totally right. You like, I just when you said it, you're right. I mean, by the time I met saw Lulu first, only time, I had already already like a pseudo white cube, but I just read that Lulu may have been because I saw Lulu and I thought, I could do this if that's amazing. I don't need to do this in New York. It is expensive, and a white cube was actually could be really great in the right time. If a white cube can make sense, and I was like, oh, that's it. That's like, I can get, yeah, that's great. You're a monster. You just, it's perfect. No, but you didn't. Asshole's fine. Am I doing it? No, I don't think. Come on, you can do it. It's like we gotta pass it on. Well, you do it.
Yes.
Is there more coffee?
Yeah, maybe you can give me a cup of coffee as well. I have the great fortune of moderating the final panel of today, institutional bandwidth, dealing with the for whom or size, audiences, agents, and aliens. So in a way, we left the room on exactly that note, the immediate audiences, but we can also talk about the international ones. Because it's so late now and we've been going on for the whole day, I think we should do a power pose. And surprisingly, it's going to be me who's going to try and like do this with you. It's going to be a first. So please all stand up and we take a minute. Okay. So that's gonna just set us off with a lot of power into this here. Calla Henkel talk about new theater that she founded with Max Petergoff in 2013. It ran till 2015 in its original format, and then morphed into a second format at the Volksbühne for 2016 autumn, 2017 spring. So Calla will speak first, then comes David Hilmer Rex and Amitai Romm that will speak about Primer, a space founded in 2016 between David and a colleague. And then last goes Elena Tozzi, who will speak about Signal Center for Contemporary Art, based in Malmö, and I should say that Primer is based in Kongens Lyngby, which is north of Copenhagen, a little hike outside of town. Okay, so with no further ado, Calla, please.
Thanks. Hi, thank you. It's very nice to be here. As said, I'm talking on behalf of myself and Max Petergoff as New Theater. So New Theater was a theater space that we ran out of an old grocery storefront in Kreuzberg, as you said, from 2013 to 2015. But to understand New Theater, I think within this context, it's best to start at situated in a 60 square meter old travel agency with one large main room, a small back room, a low ceiling basement, and a singular disgusting toilet. At its most basic, Times was a bar, an economic engine open 3 days a week, serving mediocre cocktails and cheap beer, allowing 3 near skillless recent graduates to survive. Most of the people who came to the bar were artists from all over, and after opening, we soon decided to show one piece of art above the bar. And we changed it out every 2 or so weeks. And we were excited about the idea that the bar and all of its kind of crude dumbness diffuse the ego of the gallery or the institution or even a real project space with a mission. Um, and sorry. So what we asked was that the artists would install their piece, whatever it was, while the bar was open, creating an intense and often performative moment of exchange between those drinking and the artist hanging. Lower on the right, past the hammer, etc. While the tiled bar, the artist usually stood on, hammer in hand, acted as a sort of stage as they negotiated their work in the room. Our curatorial practice was lazy, to say the least. The artists whose work we hung at times were also the artists who hung out at times. There was an immediate circuit of representation that, with a quick turnaround, allowed us to exhibit around 40 people, but exhibit is a bit generous. I think a lot of work got damaged. Documentation was at times for and is for us, Max and I, a big question as we're foremost photographers and performance artists. But we quickly realized it would be wrong to photograph in the bar while it was open, kind of believing and practicing the ethos of Berlin nightlife, safe space, and all in all, I think pictures of people drinking are usually pretty horrible. So instead, we started writing in the tab book, which we were already using daily for accounting, adding scenic description to the economic. Who owed what, who'd broken up with whom, who'd stolen what post-net art idea from who. The tab book developed into a sort of art world script, not unlike a camera spiel or a single room play. The performance and dramas of the evening braided into the fragile economic reality of the bar that we were running. We chose to close Times Bar about a year after it opened because it was getting too popular and subsequently horrible because we no longer understood who we were making drinks for. And we knew we needed to either expand or close, and I didn't want to deal with the paperwork of becoming a real bar. So we shut it down. But within that time, we knew that we had built a sort of energy of people willing, in a moment of, I think, Berlin's young art scene's hyper-professionalization, I think kind of peaked in 2012, 2013. People were willing to allow their work to be bastardized within the context of something a little bit more loose and collaborative, or at the very least shared. And Max and I felt that the performative frame of the artist standing on the bar installing their work could be extended and perhaps pushed. And as well, in the Times time period, Max and I were working with performance in our own right, and we recognized a gap between galleries where staging performance was often awkward and the audience never knew exactly how to behave, and the bizarre behemoth, the converted institutional theater conference space where nuance is often so easily butchered. In the same way, people know how to be in a bar. We love the straightforwardness of the classic theater space. Audience, here's a seat, sit till curtain closes, get up after bow. Coming from an art background, we also felt works as props, set pieces, etc., and sometimes even acting alongside of them. In this way, scripts we were writing for the plays acted as a binder for a sort of chaotic group show or a deranged press release. But unlike a group show where works compete for attention, everything had to congeal for the 45 minutes to an hour and a half that the plays usually were, with a runtime of about 3 to 6 performances stretched out over several weekends, mostly usually in English. Tickets were usually $5 to $8, and we kept it sliding scale, and if we thought a piece was bad, we usually lowered the price. We thrived on the amateur, and our actors most certainly were, myself included, mostly artists, writers, and musicians tapping into the pool of people who had populated Times Bar. We were trolling ourselves and each other, mimicking, tweaking, and editing in rehearsals. Our first play, Farming in Europe, which is the photo behind me, this is the set, was set in a 90s Berlin project space turned restaurant that traced the arc of the idealistic castle-like language of the alternative space as it collapsed into a restaurant that pretended to serve farm to table, but in the end was really shopping at Aldi. The backdrop was painted by Vittorio Brodmann. The kitchen was loaned to work by Ingve Holland, but it was his actual kitchen, so he then had to go kitchenless for the duration of the show. And Olga Belema made these metal table sculptures, which resulted in a whole choreography of cleaning, which ended up changing the show, and they rusted as the show went on. So the works always kind of impacted the scripts and vice versa, and we tried to allow things to move back and forth. We didn't set out to do it, but most of the plays we wrote at New Theatre ended up harking back to the tab books, dealing with the economics of fragile spaces, often reflecting failed alternative small business structures such as our own, a musical about a small family-run hotel in Niagara Falls that is threatened by a corporate mega hotel, an illegal ramen restaurant run by tired revolutionaries in an apartment in post-apocalyptic New York, or a bookshop in Paris that is transitioning into a nightclub. With both Times and New Theatre, the bandwidth, so to speak, depended on the hardware, how many people you could fit in the box. At New Theatre in 140 square meters, we had room for a stage, 60 seats worth of wooden benches, a seashell-covered bar, and 2 gross toilets. And again, at New Theatre, we decided not to photograph, or rather not to release any documentation, photo, or videos, instead creating an urgency for presence. We made the rule for ourselves that we wouldn't perform outside of New Theatre, outside of the storefront. And I think also this rejection of distribution created a very charged space. And as well, again, a safe space for experimentation, as every night people were, and their work were pushed outside of their comfort zone. And I think we really relied on this intimacy to allow people to kind of push farther and farther with each production and kind of each challenge. But of course, there's no policing it, and people Instagrammed, etc., whatever. It just never came from the horse's mouth, and that was kind of always our thing. There would be no official version. But the audience at New Theatre, like Times, began mostly with people we knew and snowballed as the project developed. I think there's a gasoline or a kind of chaos magic that erupts in your stomach when you watch someone you know on stage acting. And I think this is the core power of community theater, and it's completely dependent on presence, shared language, and representation. The plays themselves dealt with topics that impacted those who were around us: rising rents, climate change, Nazis, gay bars, art world economics, herpes. And the audience, I think, indirectly or not, through content, actor. So in that way, New Theatre was public, but it was also small, and it knew its audience and it performed for it. It existed in the local, but it was also a very transient local, so the bandwidth moved quickly via word of mouth. And often after seeing a play, we would get proposals for plays from audience members and friends. New Theatre was a format that attracted people who were interested in making work in between theater and performance, and coolly, mostly women, which I'm very happy about. So we developed a rule that you could only propose a play if you had already been in one. So if you wanted to propose one, great, but first get involved in whatever was coming out. This perpetuated a shared language passed on from one piece to the next. And one would have to learn the shape of the ship before captaining it. So in many ways, New Theatre was not only reliant on the audience, but it was built by the audience itself. We were very far from a white box art space or a black box theater. We were more of a gray zone that relied on the bar, again, as the great equalizer. After plays, the bar would be open and the actors would hungrily guzzle wine, and people off the street would join the audience for a drink. And in that moment, the space was still alive from the energy of the piece. So there was this kind of special mixture. And I think that's when things were the most elastic, extending the energy of what had just happened. And lots of people come to the bar several times before I think they would get the confidence to buy a ticket to come to a play, because they just didn't know what it was, and you could kind of get into it by being around it. And I think theater can be really ostracizing, and I also think art can be ostracizing, but we found like the bar to be the one thing that was the sort of main content that like people could come and attach themselves to. But the challenge was something which focuses on the local, and I think this is a topic that we're all kind of dealing with, is how it expands or doesn't. For Max and I, we had always envisioned New Theatre in its form in Kreuzberg as a 2-year project. So we did close in 2015, and we love to close things. I just love an ending. And we've run several spaces, and I think it's a really important thing so that people can kind of put everything into it and then know that they can walk away from it. And after it closed, what was interesting for us was watching what developed not from the space itself, but from the space we carved out between art and theater, and how other artists and practices moved forward with it. In that way, the bandwidth moving outwards was deep but very slow. And the space in the end acted as a sort of incubator for a new type of work, which continued even after the storefront was shuttered. I think looking back now, because we've had some time since then, we've run a different space and we're on the verge of opening a new one. The necessitating of presence and the rejection of distribution, this type of processing was in part a reaction to the type of work that was getting made in Berlin at that moment. The heavy net art, post-net art thing of that period. And we wanted to try and find a space that was more real or at least human. But I think at this point in time, that's not enough. And the challenge we confront with the next space is to try and maintain the ethos of a local space, but allow it to enter a larger conversation and not kind of rely on burrowing in and expanding, and to link with other formats of working. It's just a few years later, I know, but it does feel like more dangerous times. And I feel like it's important to figure out how not to recede or reject, but kind of to accept and broader link different conversations. And yeah, so with these new challenges in mind, we'll be reincarnating this fall as No Theater in a former sex club in West Berlin, and we're working on producing local TV from the bar. So you should come find us when we're there.
Hello. So, thank you. Maybe a little bit higher. Yeah. Thank you. So I'll just jump into it. Diachrone. So the image is from Primer.